Hi, this is Lippy. I'm a shamanic healer, and in today's video I would like to speak to you about abuse dynamics. If you look up the word abuse and dynamics separately in the dictionary, the word abuse means to either misuse someone or something, or to display constant cruelty and violence against something or someone. The word dynamics refers to a force that can stimulate growth or change in a particular system. Now, when we speak of abuse dynamics in this video, I'm going to share with you how the force of abuse, the dynamic that the dictionary defines as changing or stimulating a system, or in this case a person, makes it very, very difficult for victims of abuse to either fight back or leave. And the reason for me making this video is because I am so tired of all the victim blaming and victim shaming that goes on in our society today. And recently, today actually I was going to make a different video, and I got very, very riled up by a Facebook post by a woman the other day about how she felt that abuse victims had allowed themselves to be treated this way. And I immediately knew that it was time for me to talk about this and make this video, because I'm going to share some things in this video today which hopefully, to those of you who are willing to listen, will help you to understand that it isn't about the victim allowing the abuser to treat him or her a certain way. It is about a dynamic that changes the victim in such a way that it becomes very difficult for them to avoid the abuse. Now, what is this dynamic? To understand this dynamic, I would like you to understand the essence of abuse. And what I'm about to describe to you next has come from, I have to credit this understanding to the work of a very amazing author, and I'm gonna paste that down in the comment section below. And her name is Patricia Evans, and she is the author of several books about abuse, including a book about controlling people, and also a book about verbal abuse. And in her book, The Verbally Abusive Relationship, she talked about something that I've never heard anyone talk about before, and that was how the abuser and the victim live in totally different realities. And she calls that in the book Reality 1 and Reality 2. So the abuser lives in Reality 1, which is a reality where the worldview of the abuser is dog eat dog, survival of the fittest, and if I don't dominate, if I don't have power over someone or something, then they will overpower me. And it's all about having power over others. And most of the victims of abuse live in Reality 2, which she describes in the book as a reality where the person is coming from a totally different paradigm, and the paradigm is of mutuality and cooperation. And it's about, hey, how can we work this out? How can we help each other? How can we work with each other? And because the abuser and the victim are coming from two totally different realities, the essence of abuse is that one person, in this case the abuser, is attempting to overpower the second person, which is the victim. And as you will see as we go further into the video, this is done in a very airtight kind of way, so that it becomes very difficult for the victim to find out what's going on. And by the time they do realize what's going on, it becomes very difficult for them to leave and fight back. And when they do leave and they do fight back, often there are nasty consequences to that. So it's not like, okay, this person abused me, I'm just going to walk out the door and that's the end of the story, I'm never going to be abused again, I'm the strong person and this doesn't happen to me. As you will see as we go further into this video, it's got nothing to do with you being a strong person. It's got nothing to do with whether you didn't fight back enough. It simply has to do with a dynamic coming from one person who is hell-bent on controlling another person, and another person who's very confused about the controller's behavior because she or he are living in a reality where they just want to have cooperation and mutuality and work things out in that way. And they believe that the abuser is living in the same reality, but the two are not living in the same reality. Now, what are the hallmarks or the tenets, if I may use that word, of this dynamic? So there are 5 that I have come up with in today's video, and this is my observation because I myself am a survivor of abuse, and I now work with abuse victims for several years. My shamanic healing is predominantly aimed towards helping people recover from abuse trauma, and also in my observation of hundreds and hundreds of cases that I have seen over the years, and in my own case, regardless of whether it is sexual abuse or domestic violence, psychological abuse, financial abuse, ambient abuse, I mean, you can go on and on about the different types of abuse. The dynamics are pretty much exactly the same. And the first dynamic that is there in almost every abusive situation and abusive relationship is there is a major imbalance of power. And what do I mean by this is that the abuser either targets people who they know to have lower social power, or even if they manage to, even if the victim is lucky and they've not been targeted because they are lower on the rungs of society, the abuser will create a situation, will create eventually a dynamic where the victim is robbed of the power that they do have, and they don't even realize that it's happening. So when I say that abusers target victims who are lower in the social rungs, usually, and a lot of research shows that a majority of abusers are male. So I'm not saying that men do not get abused by women, they do, but a large chunk of victims of abuse, especially domestic violence and sexual abuse victims, are women. So the first vulnerability there is because in most countries all over the world, women are still treated as the inferior sex, and they do not have the same privileges and social standing as men. They are targeted for abuse. The other people or segment of society that are targeted for abuse by abusers are children, because they really are the lowest in the rung in terms of rights, in terms of privileges, especially because in most societies around the world there is a certain paradigm around child rearing and what children mean, and that paradigm includes ideas such as children should be seen, not heard. You are meant to have children so that they can take care of you in your old age, and spare the rod, spoil the child, and many other ideas such as this, which make children very, very potent targets for the abuser, because remember, the abuser is looking for people that they can control, that they can overpower because of the reality that they live in. The third type of person an abuser may target may be someone from a certain socio-economic background or a certain race. If that particular race or that particular socio-economic background is again lower in the rungs of power in the society in which they live. So right there and then you have a huge imbalance of power to begin with, and many people who've been in abusive situations don't realize that depending on the kind of abuser, so you have abusers who are very deliberate and very intentional with their abuse, and then you have the kind of abusers who are sort of semi-conscious of what they're doing but not entirely conscious of what they're doing all the time. Most of the time there is an intention to choose a partner who does not have enough social power, because that immediately gives you a one-up advantage. Now I know some of you who are male viewers may have a question and say, then how come, then what about men who are abused by women, you know? So yes, it's a very valid question. I would say that a lot of women who abuse men, they either choose men, if they're intentional abusers like sociopaths, who are in some way maybe in a lower position to them in the workspace, or that they have some kind of power over this man, or it could be that they choose even powerful men, but because of them being adept at manipulation, they know how to break the person down, they know how to break the man down. And yes, please don't be under this idea that, you know, if you're strong and you know, you have a lot of physical fitness, you can't be broken down by abuse. You can, because psychological abuse can be as damaging and even more damaging in some cases than physical violence. And it doesn't matter how many hours you spend at the gym, you can still be broken down by psychological abuse. It has nothing to do with your strength. The second tenet, or the second aspect of the abuse dynamic, is that, well, I'm going to have to grab my book here for a minute, is deception. Because a lot of the abuse dynamics are filled with gaslighting, which is a very, very powerful manipulation tactic, where you basically distort reality to the extent that the abuser, the victim becomes completely confused. And abusers are known to gaslight their victims, and on top of that, when victims try to get help, for example, when a victim calls out the abuser on their behavior, if, for example, the abuser has just yelled at the victim, raised their voice and yelled at this person, and the victim calls them out and says like, wow, you don't want to be using that tone with me, stop using that tone with me, the abuser may turn around and say something like, what are you talking about? I didn't yell, I didn't raise my voice, you raised your voice. So they'll gaslight the victim and turn it around and project and make it sound like the victim was the one who yelled at them. And the victim may be confused, because they may be like, whoa, wait a minute, I'm pretty sure this person yelled at me, and I'm being told that no, and I'm the one who's yelling when I'm not. And when the victim tries to get help, when they go to talk to their friends about what's happening, or even in some cases they talk to professionals, therapists, the abuser has the capacity to gaslight not only the victim but also others, and often they have a persona which is very different on the outside and very different on the inside. So the people on the outside are so fooled by that they don't believe the victim. And additionally, I have made another video on this, which I will link down in the comment section below, about how society also uses many abusive tactics to keep victims where they are, and society also gaslights victims because they don't believe victims, and that's why I'm making this video, that they shame victims, they blame victims for what is going on. Yes. Now, the third aspect or tenet of the abuse dynamic is that it is often very insidious. And when I say it's insidious in two ways. It's insidious because certain types of abuse, like psychological abuse, are so difficult to catch because they're so subtle. Like, for example, a tactic known as couching. Couching is when you say, insult someone or put somebody down or demean them, but you do it by couching it in a compliment, or you do it in a way that sounds like a joke, or you even do it in a way it's wrapped in concern. So it really is very, very confusing for the victim, because they're like, wait a minute, that sounded like an insult, but then this person is so concerned about me, and I know they've always been there for me, and maybe they really are just concerned about me, but then why did that feel so bad? I don't understand. And no, maybe I'm just seeing too much into this. Or they may hear a joke which actually sounds like an insult and actually feel hurt, because you can feel it. You can feel abuse even if you can't see it. And when they question the abuser about it and say like, whoa, was that really a joke? Because it sounded kind of like you were putting me down, and the abuser is like, no, come on, what happened to you? I thought you had a sense of humor about this. So it's very, very confusing for the victim. And a lot of the times when things like this happen in a social setting, say at a party, when the abuser makes a joke about the victim this way, or couches their insult in a compliment or in concern, because the abuser has a certain image in society, and usually they have an image which is very different from what they are at home, which is something I just mentioned earlier, and I'm repeating again because this is a very, very important thing to remember, that because this abuser has this dual image, many people are fooled by the abuser as well, and so they don't support the victim, and therefore the abuse is very, very insidious and difficult to catch. It's also insidious because it creeps up on you. So what a lot of abusers do, especially the ones who are like sociopaths or on the higher end of the malignant narcissism spectrum, or the psychopaths, who are very intentional and very deliberate in what they're trying to achieve with the abuse, is that they will turn it up a little bit at a time. So it's like that old example of the frog. If you throw a frog into boiling water, it will jump right out. But if you boil the water very slowly while the frog is in the pan, the frog doesn't realize what's happening. And that is the insidious dynamic of abuse, where by the time the victims realize what is happening, it's often very, very late in the day. And I have had a personal experience of this in every abusive relationship that I've been in. And one example I'm going to share with you today is I had a best friend for many years who is, which I realized later, a major narcissist. And she was insulting me all the time. And because she was so generous and wonderful to me in other ways, and we shared such a deep heart-to-heart connection, we used to call each other soul sisters, I actually thought that I had heard wrong, or maybe it sounded like an insult but it wasn't intended as one. It's always the intention, like I could never tell the intention, because it was a mix of someone being kind and generous and loving to you, and then turning around and insulting you every now and then. And she ended up verbally abusing me for more than 10 years of our friendship, and I didn't even realize it for years. And by the time I left that friendship, like I ended our friendship completely, my self-esteem was not zero, it was minus 30, and it took me years to get over what this person had done. The verbal abuse had such a lasting effect on me, on my confidence, and in my brain, that even today there are many times that I have to fight battles in my head with the kind of shit she put into my head about me. The third and very, very important thing to understand about the abuse dynamics is that they always, oh, I'm sorry, I thought it was the third, it is the fourth. Sorry about that. They always involve some kind of entrapment. And what do I mean by entrapment? Well, it depends on whether the abuse is very, very deliberate, because I have seen cases where somebody is being very, very abusive, and because they're so disordered, they have no idea that their behavior is abusive. And that depends on what kind of disorder they have. And then you have these malignant abusers and sociopaths and psychopaths, or you have certain types of narcissists who are very, very deliberate in their abuse with you, and they are actually trying to break you down on purpose, regardless of whether it is deliberate or coming from a delusional space. There always is entrapment, and entrapment can happen in many ways. So you could be in a situation where you are also being financially abused, which then makes it very difficult to leave because your purse strings are tied up with the abuser. You could be trauma bonded, and most of the time people are not able to leave because they're trauma bonded to the abuser. I'm going to be making a separate video on trauma bonding, but please understand that trauma bonding is neurobiological in nature, so it doesn't just involve you having a desire to constantly stick around your abuser. It involves your whole body being addicted to the abuser, being addicted to the abuse in ways which make it very, very difficult to leave. You could be someone who is trying to get help, trying to get support to be able to leave the abusive relationship, and I cannot begin to emphasize to you how important, crucial even, support is to be able to leave these kind of relationships. And you may not be getting that kind of support because your family, your friends, your religious group, your spiritual group, society, and even some therapists may actually be pushing you back to the abuser. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples about how that happens as well. Or you could even have a situation where your safety is under threat, where so let me just share with you that research statistics show that anywhere between 40 to 75% of women are killed when they try to leave their violent partners. So they're not killed while they're with the partner, they are killed, and this is not a small amount of people. This is 40 to 75% of domestic violence victims are killed while trying to leave or after they have left their partner. So what does that tell you about entrapment? I mean, you know, people say, oh well, why didn't she just get up and leave? Yeah, that's why. Children, if you have children with the abuser, that makes it very, very difficult to leave because you are in a very delicate situation, and anyone who's ever been in an abusive relationship that also involves a child will understand exactly what I'm talking about, where the child is too young to understand what's going on in some cases. You have, you know, there are legal concerns, there are legal battles you need to fight to get out safely, and many other things that are too long to get into about in just one video. But that again can make it very, very difficult for you to leave the relationship. Okay? And another thing that does happen is, in some cases, especially if you're being abused by a narcissist, there are smear campaigns. So that is a topic for another video. Narcissists and some kinds of sociopaths and psychopaths will actually create a smear campaign against the victim, where the victim is made to look like the abuser. And in many cases, people have lost jobs because of smear campaigns. I know somebody who was smear campaigned by a couple of narcissists who sort of ganged up on him. Oh my God, that man lost his wife because of the smear campaign. He lost his position in a prominent social group where he was a prominent member of. He was actually thrown out of that group, and he went into an alcohol-induced coma because he basically drank himself into a coma. And all this because of a smear campaign that was done against him by a group of narcissists. They didn't lift a finger, they didn't touch him, they didn't hit him, they didn't do nothing, but they destroyed his life. And if you are in a situation where you are married or in a relationship with a certain abuser, you suddenly find that there's no one around to help you because your name, your reputation has been smeared so badly, no one believes you. So all these things make it very, very difficult to leave the relationship, to leave the abuser. And this entrapment is mostly done on purpose. Another thing, and this is, please do not underestimate the power that abuse has to destroy your health. And when I say your health, I mean both mental and physical health. So in many cases, people who are being abused either are too mentally ill, they're either very badly traumatized, depressed, or have such severe anxiety that they actually find it very, very difficult to get out of that situation. They're just beaten down by all these things. Or in some cases, they've become physically ill. I know people who've developed cancer or diabetes or many other life-threatening illnesses because of being in high stress and abusive situations for years and years and years, and then it becomes very, very difficult for them to get out of that situation. They simply don't have the health to do it. So just to share with you two stories, examples that happened to me in my own experience, which kept me entrapped in abuse. And one was, I have been a meditator. I've always been somebody who's been deeply spiritual, and for a long time I was doing the rounds of the whole new age spiritual groups. And one of the things that kept me with my abusers is all these new age spiritual ideas, such as everything and everyone is a mirror, and you attract everything that happens to you, and things like the ideas of what they call karmic relationships, and you know, which today are I find to be really half-truths and very contrived ideas, which keep people, and it kept me in abuse dynamics, because I was actually spending so much time trying to figure out how I had attracted the abuser and what I had done, where were aspects of myself which were like the abuser, and a lot of my time and energy just went into those kind of things rather than trying to leave the abuser, because this was what was being fed to me by the spiritual groups that I was part of, and it really kept me in these kind of awful abuse dynamics. And that is an example of not only entrapment but also the gaslighting that is done by everyone, including the spiritual community, that keeps you in these horrible situations. And the other thing was that kept me in these horribly abusive relationships was when I tried to get support from friends. I would get shamed for choosing bad partners. It's like, oh, this is your energy, and you're choosing these kind of partners and things like that. Now, to some extent, I'm going to be honest, there is some truth to that, in the sense that, if you already have gone through a lot of abuse, you get primed to then choose abusers and things like that. But there are many elements to this which are not what people think they are. So the concept of choice is not what people think it is. People think choice is just you clicking your fingers and making a choice, and it does not work like that. True choice is not very easy to have. You have to build a certain reservoir within yourself to be able to make true choices, and that reservoir is missing if you are someone who has already experienced tons of abuse, because it was never built. So the choices you're making are very either misinformed or very, very unconscious, and therefore they're not true choices. So we're going to get into that in another video. But basically what I'm trying to say is these relationships and all the social structures that support them create the kind of entrapment which make it very, very difficult to leave. Finally, the fifth aspect, or the fifth tenet of the abuse dynamics, is that the abuser is usually in relentless pursuit of the victim even after the victim has left the relationship. And going back to the statistic, which was a horrifying statistic, when I first read it, I was shocked. Case in point, domestic violence victims, 40 to 75% of victims that are murdered in domestic violence cases are murdered either when they're trying to leave their partner or when they have left the relationship. And even if you're not in a domestic violence situation, even if you're in a situation where the abuse is more emotional, verbal, psychological, etc., etc., there is a concept, there is a term that is doing the rounds in pop psychology circles and on YouTube and all these videos called hoovering, which is about how the narcissist hoovers to try to get you back or pull you back. And it is so true, because I have seen it in every relationship that I've been in with a narcissist or with a sociopath, that even when you have left the relationship or they have discarded you, as they often do, they will then try everything in their power to bring you back, and you are already weakened. So even when you leave the relationship, it can take you years to recover from the abuse, and in all those years you're really, really vulnerable, and it becomes very difficult to fight the urge not to go back to your abuser. And here is another statistic from domestic violence research, and that is that on an average a woman will go back to her abusive partner at least 7 times before finally leaving. So that tells you how hard it is, how difficult it is, because the abusers will try their best to rope you in, rope you back, and again, because of the entrapment dynamic, there are many, many cases where people do go back or go back several times before they are able to finally get away, if they're lucky to get away at all. So my idea for making this video was to spread more awareness, spread more information, and to stop the victim shaming and the victim blaming that we are all participating in some way or the other, when we say things like, well, why didn't the victim fight back? And the victim is equally responsible for the abuse because they allowed the abuse to continue. And please understand, it's not about allowing. It's when you are trapped, you are weakened, your power has been deliberately taken away from you. You are not so much allowing the abuse as you are being pulled into a whirlpool, which is it's like being pulled into quicksand, or a whirlpool which is very difficult to escape from. So let's be a little bit more kind, let's be a little bit more compassionate to people who have been victimized by abusers, and let's show them the understanding that they need to heal. Because one of the reasons why victims are shamed so much is, I believe this has to do with misdirected anger. The real anger is towards the abuser, but for a variety of reasons, the abusers are so well protected, it's hard to get angry with them in any kind of way that brings transformation or change. So what society does is they turn their anger on the victim, because the victim's already down and out, and it's like kicking somebody when they're down, and you're putting all the anger that belongs to on the abuser onto the victim. And that, to me, needs to stop. We need to stop. We need to start getting a little bit more courageous with our anger and directing it where it belongs, and taking steps to change our tolerance of abusers. Because while it's not very easy to change outer circumstances, there is something called the power of society. And believe me, social psychology is more powerful than individual psychology any day. If tomorrow society gets up and says, we will no longer tolerate abuse, we will no longer tolerate abuse dynamics, believe me, a number of abusers in society will drop drastically, because society as a group is a very, very, very powerful influence. And we need to stop being lazy about banding together and taking care of what's happening on the outside. We need to look at the possibility of changing that, rather than blaming everything on the victims and expecting them to make all the changes and take the higher road, and all those kind of ideas that keep the victims victimized. Thank you very much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in my next video. Thank you and goodbye.